Mary Richards. Mary Richards.
Lizzie Lasater.
It's great to be here with you today. Welcome to our Somatic Self Care podcast. This is episode number 1, and where we've decided to start is with the book The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, which I suggest you order immediately and read along with us. We're going to do a series of episodes where we go through the book sort of piece by piece. And what do you like about this book? Sort of big picture, Mary. Why should we read this book?
I think that this book really furthers our understanding, whether you're a layperson, yoga practitioner, or someone who's generally interested in self-care. I think that this really shows how we have agency, how we can cultivate agency in our own healing processes.
I like that. I felt reading the book the first time that it's super dense. It's written by it's written by he's a psychiatrist.
He's a clinician, a clinical mental health professional and researcher.
Yeah, and I was craving sort of the bullet points or the takeaways from it. And so that's what I'm hoping you can help us with. As I read it, I felt like I was feeling yes, but also overwhelmed by the amount of detailed information that he shares. So this episode today, where I thought we'd start, is really introducing the book and talking about the prologue. If you're reading along with us, you might want to read the prologue. But I also vision that this series of conversations will work for people who haven't read the book. In case you don't have time to do your homework, we definitely want to welcome you to join us, and we'll bring you along with us, even if you haven't read it. So anything else you want to say, Mary, before we jump into the prologue?
Well, I'd just like to speak for a moment, Lizzie, to what you were saying about the density of the book, which I totally get, because the wonderful thing about Bessel van der Kolk, he's a psychiatric MD, right? And so what he offers is a survey of how, in particular in the West, we've approached mental health and wellness. And he really brings us to our bodies. So I can see how there are large sections of the book perhaps that folks might enjoy just skimming over for later, for later consumption, because there's so much practicality in the book, in the later chapters, which, we'll get to in a couple of episodes.
Yeah, I think that's a better way of putting it. It's quite sciencey. Mm-hmm. And for those of us who are less nerd oriented, but that's why we have you here, our certified yoga nerd, Mary Richards.
That's right.
My jumping off question is here on page 3. He writes that we are obviously still years from attaining detailed understanding about what's going on with trauma, but the birth of 3 new branches of science has led to an explosion of knowledge about the effects of psychological trauma, abuse, and neglect. And then he says these are the 3 new disciplines: neuroscience, the study of how the brain supports mental processes; developmental psychopathology is the second one, the study of the impact of adverse experiences on the development of mind and brain. And the third one is interpersonal neurobiology, the study of how our behavior influences the emotions, biology, and mindsets of those around us. So I'd love to focus or zoom in on this idea of interpersonal neurobiology, because when I read that, I immediately thought about yoga and our yoga practices, about how we're tuning our own biological unit and how we sometimes forget to recognize how that also has potentially positive effects on other biological units that we interact with. So could you talk a little bit about any of those three disciplines you'd like, but especially the idea of interpersonal neurobiology?
Well, since this book came out, there's now sort of an umbrella term for these three sciences as they pertain to uh, mind, body, body to brain wellness, and that's psychoneuroimmunology. And basically, what we've learned in the past, in particular 50 years, thanks largely to the work of folks like Bessel van der Kolk and Stephen Porges and other folks in the field, is that the body and the brain are really not separate entities, and that our feelings in our body inform our emotional state, and our emotional state feeds off the feelings in our bodies. And so my big takeaway is that any differentiation, if you will, between mind, body, heart, and brain is an intellectual construct designed for convenience.
Right.
Because we are all, every bit of us is wired together. The global scientific consensus is that the adult human is well over, 100 trillion cells. Okay, we're talking trillions of cells. And what's amazing is that all of them are interacting with one another on some level, electrically, chemically, et cetera. And what we've learned is that, everybody's unique, just like everyone else. And this is where mind-body interventions, as they're called in the research, practices like yoga or, qigong or tai chi, et cetera, that one of their most accessible, if you will, and meaning accessible to the person, levers to pull is that the more mindfully aware we become of our body sensations, the more aware we become of our emotions and ultimately why we may be feeling them.
Yeah, I think for me, it's like I creep down here into my studio most mornings and do my practice, which is 20 or 30 minutes of moving, breathing, meditating. And like, I can't really explain why it works or the magic of it, but I know in my bones that the mornings I start with retreating for a few minutes to close my eyes, I often play music, I'm just moving. It's like this deep introverted 20 or 30 minutes of moving the physical body and there's no thinking as much involved. I know in my bones that those are better days.
Yes. And part of that, Lizzie, is the processes that you're enlivening when you're in your yoga room and you're moving quietly at your own rhythm and you're listening to music, which of course is created by other people. So it's a community engagement, is you're actually stimulating your interpersonal biology, specifically your social engagement system. And I think one of the things that Body Keeps the Score does so well is it describes this social engagement system and its necessity, not only for helping us foster conditions of calm, relaxation, and grounded centeredness in ourselves, but it helps us recognize that in others.
Okay, so social engagement system. Sounds like something from Star Trek, like activating the social engagement system. Like what? Like, can you say it in other words? Like what? And what is it? What does that mean?
So basically, we are communal creatures, right? We live in families, we live in neighborhoods, in cities, etc. And, we've all heard the phrase, it takes a village. And that's true because we are neurologically built for connection. Because let's face it, we need the law of comparative advantage on our side to survive. So I may be good at gardening and you may be good at foraging or whatever. These are just examples that maybe I have knee problems that make it harder for me to get out into the woods to gather, the truffles and the like. And so we are organized individually to function in a collective. This is our interpersonal biology. We actually have structures in the front of our brains, the prefrontal cortex, which resides behind our foreheads. We have structures there known as mirror neurons. And those mirror neurons are really what enable us to recognize tension, ease, etc., in others. And then we will reflect in our own emotional tone, tenor, and action state similar emotions. We are mirror images of one another. Our nervous systems are wired in such a way that we are uniquely programmed to evaluate subtle facial expressions and cues and changes in voice and things like that in such a subtle way that it changes our physiology. Have you ever noticed this, Lizzie? You'll go out to your little bears, to your boys, after being in your yoga room, and everyone's a lot more chill. Even if you've come out to a Lego
explosion,
disaster, you're not as perturbed by it, and there's less perturbation in your kids, right?
Yeah.
Versus the experiences that we have, just in the daily, where maybe we haven't had a chance to connect to ourselves yet through just conscious breathing or some asana or whatever. And maybe you have an underlying feeling of anxiety, or things aren't right. Things just aren't right. And as a result, you're in the kitchen trying to get lunch prepared, and the kids are running around like crazy, and you can't focus and they can't focus. I'm sure you've had that experience.
Absolutely. And then I snap, and then suddenly I'm shouting at my children, and I'm like, I am a yoga teacher.
Yeah, then you're, yeah.
Why am I yelling?
Yeah.
So that's exactly that. That is a big piece of it. Focus for me, and it's a tension that my partner Nico and I have in the mornings. This time for me is golden, but I find a key component is that I do need to be alone.
Yes.
Like once in a while, one of the 2.5-year-old twins or both will come down and want to be in my space. And what happens is then my yoga turns immediately into gymnastics. It's like, yes, I'm just stretching my hamstrings, which has some benefits, but the internalized focus gets split for me when my kids are in the room, because then I'm like, oh, is someone drawing on the couch? Like I'm also paying attention to what they're doing, destroying my studio. And so that's what I wanted to ask, is like this irony or this mismatch somehow between the experience that so many of us have had about retreating into our solo practices, or even in the before pandemic times, going to a group yoga class, had that sense of shutting things out and retreating to the yoga mat. But what you're saying is that though that activates our social engagement system. So how do you explain this mismatch between turning inside, making us more available for people on the outside?
I'd like to reframe the term mismatch, because it's actually quite interesting. What the example you just gave, Lizzie, is so perfect, because you go into your yoga room and sometimes one of your little ones or both of them comes in and joins you, and the practice takes on a very different feel for you. It's less a practice and more of a parenting engagement. But what you're doing when you're parenting in that way is you're actually training your kids in social engagement.
Okay. But
Okay.
what about this idea that because it can feel selfish, especially for
Yeah.
mothers or caretakers, or to go away from people to do our self-care, our somatic self-care practices. But what I hear you saying, which I love, is like it's actually helps me engage when I'm engaging with myself on a regular basis. It helps me engage with others. So could you talk a little bit about that connection?
You just read my mind, Lizzie, because I was about to say, and see, this is what's happening. The reason why you're able to tolerate, and I hope that folks understand I'm using tolerance in a more like physiologic sense. You're better able to tolerate the change in rhythm when the kids come in and join you on the mat, because you have practiced so much by yourself. So the reason why you're able to do that is because your time alone, developing your attunement skills, your somatosensory attention, your ability to describe within yourself the ins and outs of your sensations, how you feel in your body, that then, whether we're explicitly aware of it or not, it puts us more in touch with our emotions. And the more in touch we are with our emotions, then in theory, the less reactive we become. We have more space to let things arise in their natural flow and to stay in sync. And we can only really become in sync with others when we're in sync with ourselves. Okay, is this making sense?
Absolutely. I'd love to dive into emotions. Like I've actually heard a doctor say to me, an MD, a surgeon that I know, said to me, I don't get what the big deal is about emotions. Like, if you're just living your life out of emotions, it's irrelevant. Like, just be rational. So there is that strain of thinking in our culture about emotions being a secondary, less necessary, or also, of course, there's kind of the male female polarity that we've had. Excuse me, that it's the female side and it's not to be focused on, and we need to just focus on rationality. So what broadly are some of the ideas that come out of this book, The Body Keeps the Score, about the sort of intelligence of emotions?
Well, I love this. So, this doctor couldn't be more behind the times.
Oh, how true. That was so true, if you knew.
Because emotions are the wellspring that from which the present moment arises. And this is later in Body Keeps the Score. Bessel van der Kolk refers to one of Darwin's works about emotions. I won't talk about this too much right now, but even Darwin back in 1872 was talking about the necessity of emotional awareness and attunement to improve our chances for physiologic survival. That's how important emotions are. Okay, so we're not machines, nor are we reptiles. Reptiles have a much simpler existence, okay? Neurologically, emotional, psychologically, etc. We are mammals, and we tend to our young, we tend to folks through our communities, etc. We are bioengineered for connection. And what is it that we are connecting to? How are we connecting to other people? Well, we connect through how we make one another feel. If emotions weren't important, we wouldn't have facial expressions. We wouldn't write poetry or music. We wouldn't fight over trucks and toys like that, you know?
Yeah.
We are feeling beings. Everything in our neurology is organized. I would say everything in our biology actually is organized toward the communal state, from how we're evaluating threats to our safety to how we are perceiving safety and reciprocity. And all of these structures that are monitoring not only our own feeling and emotional states, but that of the people we're interacting with, those neurological structures, Lizzie, are very close to our brain stem, to the areas of our brain and central nervous system that are responsible for homeostatic balance. So all of this social engagement system, the structures and features of our interpersonal biology are anatomically co-located with our foundational mechanisms for survival.
My goodness, no wonder this pandemic has been so disruptive and painful for us. It has disrupted all of our social patterns of social engagement.
Oh, yes. And I was talking to a girlfriend the other day about how my social skills have atrophied. And
Yes. I went to a party and I was like, I don't know where to put my hands. Like I'm standing here, I'm like with people, and like I feel like I'm 12.
Because we've been, for very, very sensible reasons, we've been instructed to stay physically distant from one another, to wear masks, to limit our contacts, to limit our interactions with the world outside of our homes and most intimate family members. And yet here we are, this walking radar system of how are other people feeling, and how am I relating to how other people are feeling, and how are my feelings leaking out onto other people. And we've been removed from so many common interactions, and then, layer in masks where we cannot see facial expression. It's confusing for us.
Yeah,
Because if you think
absolutely.
about it, so much of our communication is nonverbal. Like the way our interpersonal biology works, Lizzie, is, we can intuit how other people are feeling that we're interacting with just by subconsciously perceiving the level of tension in their body.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, as we move to close for today, I would love to read a sentence from page 4 of the prologue and get your thoughts and reactions to this. Bessel writes, but we also see that the imprints from the past can be transformed by having physical experiences that directly contradict the helplessness, rage, and collapse that are part of trauma, and thereby regaining self-mastery. Immediately, I've written in the margin here, equals restorative yoga ? So can you speak a little bit, Mary, about the somatic self-care practices and being perhaps as specific as possible? Can you give us a couple somatic self-care practices that you love that help us have physical experiences that directly contradict traumatic experiences in the past?
Yeah, so the wellspring from which this wisdom it arises, that Bessel van der Kolk so eloquently presents in Body Keeps the Score, is basically, we live in our bodies. Okay, so we've been taught to live in our brains. The brain, our thinking brain, is our most important feature. It's what differentiates us from other animals, etc. Here's the actual experiential reality, though, and that is we're embodied creatures, and every nanosecond, our bodies, unbeknownst to our conscious thinking minds, are making adjustments to keep us healthy, alive, safe, etc. And what we can do, especially when we've experienced trauma, whether it's emotional trauma or physical injury, is we can once again become friends with our bodies. Instead of trying to think our way out of pain, we actually need to feel our way into ourselves, feel our way into discomforts and ease. And so this is where yoga offers numerous tools available to us to help us reconnect to our grid, if you will, our power grid. And that really does reside in the body. So not only do we have restorative yoga, which is excellent for helping us unwind tension in the body and the mind and to physiologically rest, okay? Because see, if we're not able to rest, there's no way we can make decisions or plan or dream or visualize, because we are in a state of hypervigilant tension that actually turns off the areas of the brain responsible for decision making and dreaming and the like, creativity and the like, okay? So restorative yoga helps with physical and mental tension, and pranayama is one of the most potent strategies that we have for connecting ourselves to the present moment and our felt sense of living right here, right now. Because when we are paying attention to the breath, we can't really think about anything else. And so by doing that, by anchoring ourselves in the awareness of the breath, then we are able to go deeper into ourselves and, oh, I feel this pain in my low back. And oh, the emotions that attend that are fear or anxiety, whatever it is, it's these practices of yoga, they basically help us create a container in which we can observe our experience right here, right now, root ourselves in the present. And this is very important when we're talking about trauma, because trauma has occurred in the past. And so what's happening with after we've had trauma is our physiology has been remodeled. And so it's stuck, if you will, in this threat responsiveness based on what happened to us before. And in order for us to soften the grip of the trauma, we need to spend more time in the present. And that's exactly what practices like asana, slow moving, in particular, slow moving asana, pranayama, restorative yoga, japa, mudra repetition, meditation. That's exactly what these practices do for us.
Oh, all right. I have one last question before we close. How do you define trauma for someone who's listening? I mean, I immediately think of, for example, when I brought my twins home from the hospital, the kind of hypervigilant system that turned on for me. Like, sort of, I mean, it was such a wonderful gift, these two healthy, full-term baby boys, but it was also, I experienced what I would call, but then it feels almost like I shouldn't be allowed to call that trauma, because trauma is like horrible, horrible things that we hear about that happen in people's childhoods with abuse and sexual, like, you know what I'm saying? So like, how big, where do you draw the line around trauma, or how do you define who has been through, who of us has been through trauma?
If we're alive, we have trauma. And I'm not saying that to be flip. Trauma doesn't have to be some big event. Everyone, see, all of us are wired a little differently. We have the most differentiation on our vascular and nervous system levels. Just anatomically, we're all wired differently, a bit differently. Okay. But more than that, we each have our own lived experience.
Oh, I hear Kira back there, doggy Kira.
Kira's lived experience is to change her sleeping position right now. So this is the thing, like, it's not that I've had more trauma than you, or you've had more trauma than me. It's how do you feel? How did something affect you? And so that could be a teacher in school just constantly calling you out. You know what I mean? That can be traumatic, be under having just criticism. And maybe this teacher's intentions are, maybe they have a growth mentality and they just believe the criticism is helping you, but you may not be hearing it as helpful. That can be traumatic. The key differentiation, I would say, between trauma and upset, something that upsets you, but you're able to let go, is that an experience sticks with you in such a way that it activates your sympathetic nervous system.
Yeah.
So you store tension, you ruminate, you engage in negative self-talk, you experience difficult emotions that you'd like perhaps to disassociate from. So for me, the difference is what the effects are in the person. How have we been rewired in response to stimuli?
So wonderful, as always, to speak with you, Mary Richards. You can tell us where we can find you on the internet.
Well, you can find me at yogawithmaryrichards.com website. That's my Insta handle and all of that. And soon I'll have a Substack newsletter up.
Yay!
I'm working on that. So, and of course, you can always find me skulking about with you, Lizzie.
Yes, I hope you're already subscribed to my newsletter, which you can find by going to lizzie.yoga, Lizzie.yoga. Mary and I are your optimistic, enthusiastic cheerleaders for simple ways that you can take better care of your sweet self. We believe in you, and I love you, Mary Richards.
I love you, Lizzie Lasater.
Bye.